kick off and ask John to speak, and hopefully at the end we'll have a chance for comments and any questions. So welcome, John, and look forward to hearing what you have to tell us.
Good evening, and thank you, first of all, to Pauline and Dave for this very kind invitation. There's nobody, or no figure in modern history, I'd say, who I admire, I think, as much as Keir Hardie. So I really feel it's an honour to have the opportunity to talk about him. I will try to keep it to slightly over 20 minutes, which hopefully will give us plenty of time to discuss things. In late September 1907, James Keir Hardie was travelling through the province of British India, then known as East Bengal, now Bangladesh. And the region was in ferment because of the recent partition imposed by the previous Viceroy, Lord Curzon, in what was widely seen as a blatant divide and rule strategy. Curzon had split the mainly Hindu West Bengal with its Calcutta-based political intelligentsia from the east with its largely Muslim peasantry. And in response, activists had initiated a campaign known as Swadeshi, which means self-sufficiency. And they were boycotting British goods, especially textiles, and promoting local products. When Keir Hardie arrived in Calcutta, he was intrigued by what was happening. It was, in a sense, the first modern Indian political movement. It was something very different from the protests of the 19th century, and he wanted to understand it. And that decision would plunge him into a massive worldwide political controversy, which he didn't foresee at the time. So what was Hardie doing in India? Well, as you all know, in the 1906 general election, he had led this incredible triumph of the Labour Representation Committee, where they get 29 Labour MPs in Parliament for the first time, and that enables them to constitute the beginning of the Parliamentary Labour Party. But by the time he reached that high point, Hardie's health was deteriorating. He obviously had an incredibly hard life. Boy labourer, boy miner, never had much money, and his health had taken an incredible beating. In the early part of 1917, he was really not very well, and a wealthy donor paid for Hardie to go on a world, essentially an extended world cruise, or a series of cruises, with the hope that he recover. This is, of course, the great age of the ocean liner, and doctors placed great store in ocean air, often because they couldn't do a lot else than make such a suggestion. The journey was essentially planned as a trip through the British Empire, and I'll come back to why that was. With the exception of Japan, the places Hardie would visit were all coloured red on the map: Canada, Singapore, India, Ceylon, Australia, New Zealand, and the southern African settler colonies of Natal, Transvaal, the Orange Free State, the Cape, and Basutoland. Pretty extensive itinerary. So that was what he was doing. Let's go back to India. Now, Hardie leaves Calcutta on a train accompanied by a Swadeshi activist called Jagesh Chowdhury. And he talks about this ride through the flat, swampy landscape and seeing the farmers ploughing with their water buffaloes. And from there, from the train, they transfer to a steamer, and they go along the river on this river steamer, stopping at places along the way. And Hardie sees the huge police presence and is very critical, obviously, of the repression which is going on. One evening, the steamer arrives at a town called Barisal, and through the gloom, a crowd of Swadeshi militants come down to greet the famous visitor. Hardie goes on shore. He walks up to the government bungalow where he'll be staying and stands on the steps, and there he gives an impassioned speech. He declared he would do his best to make India a self-governing colony like Canada. What was good for the Canadians must also be good for the Indians. And subsequently, while at Barisal, he gives an interview to a Bengali newspaper in which he said that the heavy-handed policing of protests savored more of Russian than of British methods. Hardie's statements in Barisal set off a political firestorm which would rage across the British Empire. The Reuters news agency picked up the story, and that leads to a thundering editorial in the Times back in London on the 2nd of October. The Times leader writer was infuriated by what he saw as Hardie's undermining of the Raj. And he writes, "We have never doubted the power for mischief which persons like Mr. Hardie possess, nor their readiness to exert these powers. By selecting Eastern Bengal as the theatre for the display of his qualities as a demagogue, he has given conclusive proof that the estimate we had formed of his criminal ignorance or his yet more criminal recklessness was all too just." As you can see, the Times hasn't really changed very much. Moreover, Reuters, I shall see at that point. So this editorial launches a tidal wave of denunciation of Hardie by Conservative members of Parliament and the Tory press. Even most of his Labour Party parliamentary colleagues ran for cover under these accusations of disloyalty. Only a few outspoken radicals like R.B. Cunningham Graham came vigorously to his defence. But the anger was also particularly intense against Hardie in Southern Africa, which was further down his itinerary. And there, that anger was amongst the British settlers for some very particular reasons. In fact, their anger was to become such that it would threaten Hardie's life in the Southern African leg of his trip. Hardie was already unpopular with settlers in Southern Africa. In 1906, a tax rebellion had broken out amongst the Zulu-speaking people of Natal colony. It had been bloodily repressed by Natal and Transvaal troops. Hardie had taken up the grievances of the rebels, clashing repeatedly in Parliament over this with the Under-Secretary for the Colonies, Mr. Winston Churchill. That would have been enough to create an uproar. But on top of that, Hardie's advocacy for Indian nationalism struck a sensitive chord. In Natal and the Transvaal, settlers resented the economic success of the mainly Gujarati Indian merchants, and white workers felt threatened by what they saw as cheap Asian labor. On top of this, in the Transvaal, the Indian community had recently embarked on a campaign of resistance against discriminatory legislation under a young lawyer, one Mohandas Gandhi. This was Gandhi emerging for the first time as a political leader, and that evoked the fury of many of the whites. Anti-Indian sentiment was thus now also channeled towards Hardie, and I'll show later how that played out. I want to highlight three main points, though, before I go to the events of the rest of the voyage, about Hardie's relationship to the British Empire. Firstly, Hardie's trip was in some ways a visit to the British Labour diaspora, a phenomenon with which he had a complex and conflicted relationship. So between 1870 roughly and 1914, there's an enormous amount of British emigration, particularly working class emigration, to the settler colonies of Canada, Australasia, and to a lesser extent, South Africa. And some of these immigrants took with them their experience in unions and labor movements. And for many of them, Hardie, as a result, is a hero. And in the settler colonies, they replicate many of these structures with great success. So, Australians and New Zealanders had labor people in government before Britain did. For Hardie, this is like a sort of extended family as he goes from places from Vancouver to Kalgoorlie to Pretoria. He's welcomed to dinners and banquets and festive occasions, people who really appreciate him. But one thing that really distinguished Hardie in his time was what I would argue was his genuine and fairly consistent anti-racism. He was really somebody who believed in human equality. And yet in his time, he was somewhat fighting against the tide, because at a time between, I'd say, about 1880 and 1920 is a kind of high point of biological racist ideology. And to a considerable extent, it affects and infects, one might say, the labour movement, including the British labour movement and its diaspora. So there's this kind of conflict that it's an era of extraordinary anti-capitalist mobilisation and militancy in the British labour movement, not only at home, but in its sort of extensions in the rest of the world, culminating, of course, in the syndicalist strikes of the years immediately before the First World War, which take place in places like South Africa and Australia as well. But white workers were often susceptible to the idea that they were threatened by the competition of cheaper Asian and African labour, and that racial political messages, political measures were a solution to this. So that, for example, British sailors campaigned against Asian and African labourers on British ships. British Columbia, white workers riot against Asians. Foundation of the Australian state in 1901 saw the adoption, right at the beginning, of the White Australia policy, excluding immigration of people of colour. And in Southern Africa, white workers moved towards promoting legislation reserving skilled jobs for whites. And now Hardie was not always consistent in how he replied to these policies, but he clearly was at least uneasy and often directly opposed to them. And he was always looking rather for this politics of division, for ways of surpassing division and reaching out beyond this British Labour diaspora. So not only does he take up the cause of Indian nationalism, as we've seen, but on his trip, he expressed skepticism towards the White Australia ideas. He spoke for the idea of black unions in South Africa. He hoped that the relatively liberal franchise in the South African Cape, which did include the vote for some men of colour, would be extended elsewhere in the region and so on. So in a world and a labour movement which was significantly affected by racism, Hardie was looking for another way. He was a genuine opponent of these ideas. Secondly, I think Southern Africa is really crucial to Hardie's politics, and indeed to British politics in this era. I think that's often underestimated. I often say that there are only two times in history when Southern Africa has been central in world politics. The one was the era of the anti-apartheid movement, which no doubt at least some of you participated in. But the other was the Boer War of 1899 to 1902, which became a sort of focus for all sorts of ideas about imperialism and national rights and so on, and its aftermath in the political settlement in South Africa after the war, which was actually something which people took a lot of interest in. The British instigation of the war by Joseph Chamberlain and Sir Alfred Milner was an extraordinary act of political cynicism motivated by the desire to control the Transvaal's gold supply. It often strikes me as extraordinarily parallel to the Iraq War as a sort of engineered war. It involved a policy of extreme harshness in which poor women and children and African laborers were rounded up into what were for the first time called concentration camps, where many died of disease and malnutrition. And this war was the target of Hardie's righteous anger. He bravely faced jingoistic crowds, a lot of public meetings over this question. He called the war Millionaires' War. And the divisions which the war inspired were actually quite important to the Labour Party. I mean, one thing that happened was that Hardie and the small group around him in Parliament were able to collaborate in the opposition to the war with the Irish Party. Irish nationalists were very, very pro-Boer. And that was not unimportant. I also think that the unpopularity of the war helped to pull some people who'd been sort of, if you like, Gladstonian liberals away from the Liberal Party, which is increasingly getting sucked into imperialism, and maybe made them available as Labour voters. Now, Hardie did, in fact, to some extent, kind of idealize the Boers as a simple rural people who were victims of rapacious capitalists, and clearly it was more complicated than that. But unlike many of the pro-Boers, he did not neglect the position of Black South Africans. After the Liberals came to power in the UK in 1906, they first gave white settlers in the Transvaal and the Free State self-government. And they then allowed the unification of South Africa in 1910 on a mainly white franchise. Hardie was unsuccessfully to fight against this process of handing power over to the whites. And so, for example, in 1909, when an African delegation comes over to oppose this, he welcomes them and supports them. And he is actually contributes significantly to minor but important thing in world history, which is that the kingdom of the Basotho, where Hardie had actually met the chiefs during his trip, was wanted by the new South African government for a corporation, and Hardie manages to contribute to opposing that. So the existence of the kingdom of the state, I should say, of Lesotho in Southern Africa actually partly owes its existence to Keir Hardie. My third point is that Hardie's anti-imperialism is in some ways different from the way that people would understand anti-imperialism today. But I think in ways which it's important to understand, and I would say respect. It's clear from many of Hardie's statements that what he envisaged for India and at a latter stage for other Asian and African colonies was self-government within the empire rather than total independence. This very much obviously goes against the grain of contemporary thinking about anti-imperialism and how the anti-colonial movement developed. But I think it's important to understand that at the time, this also actually reflected the position of most of the anti-colonial activists in the colonies who Hardie was collaborating with. So, you know, if you look at Gandhi, for example, when Gandhi wrote his famous manifesto, Hind Swaraj, in 1909, its subtitle was not Indian independence, but Indian home rule. So suggesting essentially a parallel with the liberal policy for Ireland. And Gandhi and the Indian National Congress did not, in fact, call for total independence until well after Gandhi returned to India in 1915. So that idea of self-rule within the empire, really on the model of the emerging settler colonies of Canada, Australia, and South Africa, is actually a very powerful idea at the time. And of course, those countries, that model is a model where you do have full democratic self-government, but it's still part of the empire. So leaving the empire was not necessarily something which radical nationalists at the time believed in. The other thing was that I think there's a sort of interestingly anti-nationalist element to the way Hardie thinks about things. He talks in very impassioned terms about the federation of the world, that he's not really about creating new nations, he's about creating a unified internationalist world based on equality. And I think that's why in some ways he's attracted by the idea of, if you like, a democratization of the empire. It also goes along with his mainly peaceful strategies and more sort of evolutionary strategy. Unlike Gandhi, of course, Hardie was not an absolute pacifist, but he did believe in self-defense and so on. But he did generally seek to find peaceful methods. And so I think that's that sort of interesting peculiarity. So let me now briefly outline some of the major events of the rest of the trip and then wrap it up. So after Barisal, Hardie does this absolutely epic train journey across India. He goes right across the north to the Punjab, then he goes down to Bombay, to Madras, and at the end he also visits Ceylon. But as he goes along, he makes frequent stops along the way, meeting an incredibly wide range of people. And Hardie emerges as a really dedicated social researcher. He goes into the villages with his notebooks, he sits down with people, he, through interpreters, asks questions about what they're doing, and he makes incredibly detailed notes about the economic conditions and so on. He deplored the British military presence. He was quite impressed. One of the things he was quite impressed by was some of the Indian princely states had kind of reformed social policies, and he looks with a lot of interest what happens in Baroda and Mysore. Hardie's thoughts about his experiences were recorded in newspaper articles, but also in a still, I think, rather charming and readable book, India, Impressions and Suggestions, but in which he gives a damning verdict on British India, a kind of process of military repression and extraction. And if I can just quote him, Hardie says, "Such then is the government of India, bureaucratic in form and harsh and exacting in all its relations towards the people. To the heads of department, the people of India are so many seeds in an oil mill to be crushed for the oil that they yield." From November to February, Hardie made an extended visit to Australasia, hopping by ship from one city to another. He was impressed with the social reforms of the Labour parties in the two countries, but he did tend to see their Labour leaders as rather excessively conciliatory towards the capitalist parties. The trip was restful. He was widely welcomed. There was a minor motorcar accident, early motorcar accident in New Zealand, but fortunately was not really badly injured. So it seemed to be a very fascinating trip for him. And of course, he does have this great curiosity and enthusiasm for everything he sees. So after crossing the Indian Ocean on the ship Narang, Hardie arrives in Durban, Natal, and he gives a couple of newspaper interviews on arrival, trying to sort of play down the radical implications of some of his ideas, but it didn't do him any good. Over the next couple of weeks, he faced hostile mobs of British settlers attacking his meetings. Generally, he was politically and where necessary physically defended by the British immigrant Labour activists, even though many of them were a bit skeptical about his racial politics. Impressionistically, I think the attackers seem to have come from British immigrant upper and middle class people, maybe some lumpens. Afrikaners were not actually hostile to Hardie because they remembered his support in the Boer War, which they rather appreciated. So the next couple of weeks is just absolute chaos. There's a public meeting in Durban, which has to be abandoned under hail of missiles. The town of Ladysmith, he gets through a meeting defended by railwaymen who kind of have to fight hecklers as the meeting goes on. And he goes up the railway line to Johannesburg. And as they pull into Park Station, Johannesburg, there is this roaring crowd, which is basically wanting to lynch Hardie. And this little knot of supporters led by a Scottish syndicalist called Archie Crawford, who I would love to talk about if we have time, run down and they kind of grab Hardie and they pull him through the crowd, get him into a landau or horse-drawn carriage, and they gallop off at great speed. Now that evening, they hold a meeting in the Caledonian Hall, where else, and it's attended by about 1,000 people, most of whom are hostile. So you have Hardie up on the stage, the Labour activists crowding around the front of the stage to protect him, and free fighting going on. Hardie's unable to speak, drowned out by cries of Zulu Hardie and the singing of Rule Britannia. He was smuggled to safety and the meeting broke up amongst fistfights. But the most severe incident came at his meeting in Pretoria. Hardie successfully struggled through his speech, but the hall was besieged by an angry crowd of 3,000 held back by police. The cops got Hardie into a cab which raced away. But by the time he got to his hotel, some of the mob had reassembled there, where they threateningly sang, "We'll hang Keir Hardie on a sour apple tree," before dispersing. After that, it all calmed down a bit. Hardie moves through the Free State, Basutoland, and the Cape. He meets interesting people like the great South African writer Olive Schreiner, traditional chiefs in Basutoland. And there's a friendly socialist meeting in Cape Town where Hardie appreciates the fact that in the Cape, unlike in the Transvaal, the unions are actually integrated, and there are actually quite a lot of men of colour in the unions. So I think this presents a complex picture of Hardie. There's a complex picture of Hardie in South Africa. On the one hand, the local trade unionists and political labour activists almost worshipped him for his historic role. Most of them are actually immigrants or the children of recent immigrants. And they identify with him. But they're also very much into this sort of white labourist movement. So, for example, the dynamic leader of the Transvaal Miners Union, Cornishman Tom Matthews, another extraordinary character I'd love to talk about, dedicated much of his recent political career to opposing the use of Chinese labour on the mines, which was indeed very, very problematic, but he opposes it in this extraordinarily racist manner. But that wasn't universal. There were some people like Crawford, who I've mentioned before, who have a very different position, more like Hardie's non-racialism. And there's no doubt that Hardie's Voyage had a transformative effect on his political vision. He had already been strongly critical of colonial policy before he went. But it's striking how much parliamentary time he puts into Indian and South African questions after returning to Westminster in 1908. He really, I think, gets quite a deep understanding from where he's been. So if you look, if you go into Hansard, what you'll see there is him asking very, very detailed questions about particular things which are happening in particular villages in India and so on. And he's obviously drawing on these networks he's established. As I've mentioned, he engages in the critical politics around the creation of Union of South Africa. There's a nice article by this popular article by Martin Plaut on Hardie welcoming the South African delegation. But he also does maintain his links with the white unions in South Africa. There's a big deportation of union activists, British-born union activists in 1914, and Hardie participates in a huge demonstration in Hyde Park about that. So, as I've suggested, I think Hardie's way of understanding the issues of colonialism and anti-colonialism was perhaps different from how we would understand it today, but it was characterized by a deep humanity and egalitarianism and a remarkable fight against the imperialism, the biological racism, and the white labor protectionism, which was so prevalent. And Hardie gave a striking warning, which I think still speaks to us today. At his meeting in Cape Town, Hardie remarked, "Socialism stands for the rights of humanity and of human beings. And if the white working people countenance the exploitation of the colored races, then they themselves must expect to be exploited." The language may not be that we would use, but the point remains all too valid. Thank you.